has germinative center, think about activation B cells. We're talking about spleen here, and specifically the larger B cells. This is why anytime you have lymphoma, the spleen can be involved. You're going to have lymphatic sheath, periarterial lymphatic sheath. This is where you're going to have the T cells, which you call the PALs. And the marginal zone, this is where you're going to have macrophages and antigen-presenting cells. And then you're going to have the red purple. This is where you're going to have a lot of blood vessels, and this is where you're going to have a lot of macrophages and red cells in the area. And remember that the capillary are fenestrated type of capillary, a fenestrated basement membrane. So these are called sinusoid type of capillary. This type of capillary allow the big movement of cells inside them and outside them. So asplenia, remember you have encapsulated bacteria. We went over it several times, so you should know it by now very, very well. And the red cells that change, remember, they look like helmets, and other manifestation of asplenia that you know by now. So typical lymph nodes with the capsule, remember you're going to have 4 afferent and 1 afferent type of exit. So in the cortex, this is where you're going to have the B cells, the dendritic cells, macrophages, and the paracortex, which are close to the medulla. So we're going to have T cell dendritic cells. Most of the blood vessels are going to be going from the hilum, where you have the different lymph nodes. In the medulla, you're going to have more of macrophage and plasma cells, specifically in the cords, which are these. And then, so the structure of it, beside the capsule, you're going to have primary follicle, and you're going to have the germinative centers. And around the germinative center, this is what you call the mantle zone. And this mantle zone and germinative center form the secondary follicle. Keep those in mind. Histology of the lymph node are commonly asked, so that's not the real histology of it, which we did cover many times, and go from there. Remember the drainage. Actually, there was one question about this, where they put you a picture, and they ask you, okay, look at your Viber. I'm going to send you a picture right now, if you decide to allow it. And then okay, I just sent it to you. And the question is, left-sided subclavicular enlargement seen in this photography. What does it represent? Did you receive it? Okay, so what does it represent? Yes, very good, Jakob. A vertical lymph node, although it can be a vertical lymph node, can be a little bit more inside, but that's fine. So knowing your drainage of your lymph nodes and the lymphatic are very important for anatomy questions. So know them. So in here, this picture is about the drainage, cervical drainage. Where does it go? Healer, mediastinal, etc. So know them where to go, especially around the inguinal. That sometimes you don't think about, mostly in the para-aortic. And also knowing the drainage can tell you if you have metastasis or if you have an infection and you have an enlargement of these lymph nodes to know where to go and what are the trajectory of the metastasis. So mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. Um, so the mucosal response to remember that all these GI and respiratory are going to have IgA as immunoglobulin, mostly affected. So these are antibodies that are producing cells, and the effector are going to be T cells that are going to exist in the what you call the MALT system, the mucose-associated lymphoid tissue. And then you're going to have separation between the effector and stuff. Then you're going to have the cells that we're going to allow the development of mucosal immune system. Those are the enterobacterial flora. This is why babies, for example, are pretty much sensitive to have diarrhea and infectious diarrhea, gastroenteritis, because their system is not well developed as yet. So the MALT system do have multiple subclass. Know them. They're high yield. You have the GOLD, which is the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. You have the NALT, which is nasopharyngeal-associated lymphoid tissue. You have the BOLT, which is bronchus-associated lymphoid tissue, and you have the orogenital. So the GOLD would be all the Peyer's patch, mesenteric lymphoids nodes, the appendix, solitary lymphoid nodes. The NALT would be all the salivary gland and tonsils. And remember, the tonsils need to know the three types of tonsils and how they look like and their histology. Which are questions. Remember, they're all the same. The difference is the tonsil to have a cleft inside it, and you look at the epithelium, which is a stratovascular epithelium, non-keratinized. So all these are going to give you two types of mucosal surface, which is type 1 mucosal surface and type 2 mucosal surface. Type 1 mucosal surface are covered by simple epithelial that will have polymeric Ig receptors, which you call PLGR. And what is the function of this Ig receptor polymeric is going to mostly for the IgA that will allow the IgA to access lumen. So this is why one of the reasons that you're going to have a lot of IgA in intestine and the lung, respiratory, the lung, and the uterus. The type 2 mucosal surface, that is like the tonsil, you're going to have stratified squamous epithelium, not keratinized, and those are mostly multiple type of defense mechanism as a barrier first, and then as the lymph node underneath it. So you have multiple defense. And remember, those areas are going to be areas where you have a lot of bacteria, a lot of connection with the outside. So this is why the type 2 mucosal surface is going to find it in oral cavities in the throat and the vaginal cavities. And you know that these two has stratified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized. These as well can be direct or indirect type of question or mentioned within the case. And then they tell you where do you find such type of tissue. So now you know. So why do you need, what does it mean mucosal immunity? It means you're going to have a lot of bacteria over there that have an adhesion there. And if the immune system decrease, you can have an infection. Remember, for example, that the vagina do have a certain amount of bacteria that maintain a pH, maintain everything. And once these bacteria decrease, you have vaginosis, and you have Candida albicans infection. So that's showing that the protection comes from microbial colonization. The throat as well, you have a lot of bacteria that maintain certain equilibrium and viruses that maintain certain equilibrium without being a big problem. The other reason for this mucosal immunity is prevention of environment sensitization, so changes. They can focus off much vaccine work. And they have regulation from systemic immunity. So, like I said, decrease of those bacteria lead to mycobacteria, lead to candida albicans infection. And this area that are going to block allergic sensitization. Not 100% blockage, but you have a big amount of blockage. Then the other thing is about the IgA. All these mucosal immunity are going to have a lot of IgA, which are suppressed IgA, and you're going to have something like more than 3 grams of it. You don't need to know how much as a measurement, but the thing that you need to know about this circulatory IgA is going to be what are the two types, the isotype. So you're going to have two types. You have A1 and A2, and both of them are tissue specific. The A2 one, this is the one that it's a mucosal plasma cells. We work with mucosal plasma cells. Obviously, our immunoglobulins, so plasma cells producing it, and they're going to have a resistance for IgA protease. That can be the one of the question as well. And they're going to have a G chain of it. So the O-MALT classification, remember one of the keywords in here will be the M cell. And you're going to have the same structure as any lymph node. So you're going to have germinative center, you're going to have parafollicular region, which are all around. And you have, in this situation, because you're in GI, you're going to have a dome in the top. So a lot of M cells going on, and you have the follicular-associated epithelium. So this can be a representation of Peyer's patch, for example, typical for mesenteric lymph node as well. So remember the M cells, they're going to have a control on the entry site of some bacteria. And this is where they're going to be pretty much reactive to poliovirus, HIV, rotavirus, the bacteria that also they allow the or will be destroyed: Vibrio cholera, E. coli, Salmonella, Salmonella typhimurium, Shigella, Yersinia, the both type of tuberculotica and the pseudotuberculosis, and the Campylobacter jejuni. So these are what they're going to fight. So know the bacteria that they're going to fight the entries. So the immune response, you're going to have multiple type of immune response. The innate immunity, and that is the major cells, all the white cells. The inflammatory response, and then the treatment, so drugs, and then the adaptive immunity. That you're going to start to produce the memory cells of certain type of infection. If you have dysfunction of these, are going to be immunodeficiency, the allergies, the transplant pathology itself, or the rejection, and the autoimmunity. Do not mix up autoimmunity with the immunodeficiency. Immunodeficiency don't have defense. Autoimmunity, that you are attacked by your own cells. So you know this, already. So I'm going to move on. As I said, this is just a fast review. And remember the acquire one. It's an amplification of all the memory cells, and which you're going to stick for a while. So you're going to have two major components: the cell-mediated and the antibodies. So the antibodies, you're going to have two types: the antibody-mediated immunity, which are stimulated and triggered by antigens, and you're going to antibodies that also know as the immunoglobulin produced by the plasma cells. And remember that anything that is innate is the first line of defense, and anything else can attack it without any problem. So everything else you should know. So the barrier, some barrier that would be asked. Uh, they can ask you anything of barrier, but remember chemical barrier. This is about the ACL, the gastric juice, the lysosome, the saliva acidity, sebum, and the uronic acid, uh, and anything else which is physical. So those are chemical. Lysosome, the one of the example is the enzyme that you found in a tear or sweat. Physical, you know by now, the skin is the first biggest organ that will protect you, but what you need to know is about the antimicrobial substance that you found within the skin. And that is the dermacidin, lysozyme, sebum, and defensin. This is why you have a lot of sebum when you have some type of inflammation in some areas. Obviously, the mucous membrane are because of the IgA and defensin. Which defensin is a kind of antibiotics. You know that by now. Hair, ciliary, and defecation, vomit, all these are pretty much defense mechanism. And defecation and vomit is just to eliminate all the bacteria that give you the inflammation locally. Physical and chemical barrier is the first line of defense, as you know. Then you have the non-specific resistance, which are the innate. These are secondary line of defense. So you have anything that is phagocyte cells, inflammatory, inflammation. Remember, anything give you inflammation, acute or chronic, and then fever is a kind of defense because with fever you're going to inhibit bacterial growth, and you increase the rate of tissue repair during an infection. This is why it's not always good to decrease the fever, but you need to be under control. So you need a mechanism of phagocyte cells, and you need to know what are phagocyte cells. Remember macrophages. So what are the phagocyte cells? Give me the name. Now dendritic cells are ready. You're going to put them in there. All these are white cells. Yakov, any eosinophil? Yes. Neutrophils? Lymphocyte? No. Oh my God! I thought you knew this. One more. Dendritic cell will be underneath this name. Basophil? No. Eosinophil, neutrophils, and macrophages. These are the three big for phagocyte. Everything else is not phagocytic. It's mostly producing the histamine or immunoglobulins. Mm. Specific resistance. These are what you call the acquired immunity. These are the third line of defense, which is the antigen antibodies that they're going to be regenerated. And so, how it's going to happen is when the antigen is going to be detected by macrophage, this is going to cause the T cells to become activated. Once they're activated by specific antigen, this is what you call cell-mediated immunity. And then the T cells is going to start to secrete interleukin 2, Once the interleukin 2 is going to be secreted, that will lead you to proliferation of cytotoxic T cells and B cells. So from that, you're going to have, obviously with interleukin 2, you're going to start to have fever as well. That's going to happen. And from there, you're going to have the path of cytotoxic T cells destroying everything, and the path of B cells that are going to start to produce antigens, antibodies, um, and the antibodies, not the antigen, antibodies, and then going to create memory cells. So this as well are big questions for the step, the difference between innate and adaptive immunity. So you're going to have multiple feature in here, including genetic, the composition of it, recognition, the response, and the resistance. So remember that the resistance is always caused by pathogenic virulence factor that can resist any aggression or any attack. And meaning that your innate system can be disabled by this type of virulence factor. That is for the innate. But for the adaptive, the resistance is going to create mutation of the recognized antigen. So more mutation you're going to have, and more resistant you're going to become, because your maturation is going to of the antigen that you have already is not going to be function anymore. You have something new that happened, and this is how all viruses and bacteria are going to react. So the genetic of it is that innate is you're born with it. It's encoded in your germline. And so you get it from your parents. This is what evolved for thousands of years, the resistance of some bacteria that happened thousands of years ago. The adaptive, you learn every day and you develop and you fight every day. So you're going to have two components for adaptive that we saw earlier, which is the VD and G region within the cells. And this is something that you don't get from your parents. You learn it every day. Uh, so these are going to be a recombination of the region, the VDG region, and they're going to change and become variable. So components, most of the innate are going to use the myeloid lineage, neutrophil monocyte and macrophages, natural killer, complement and barrier, a physical barrier that you're born with. As the adaptive, you're going to have the new cells, the killer CD8, the helper CD4, the B cells, and the antibodies that once you recognize something, immunization stuff, will allow you to have this type of event. Recognition. For recognition for the innates, you're going to have here just example of three of them: the APS, flagellin, and nucleic acid. These are using a receptor that they are going to really recognize the bacteria or the pathogens that is associated with it, which you call pathogen-associated molecular pattern, the pumps. Remember the term pumps and pathogen-associated. If you hear it, think innate immunity. Don't bother. Adaptive immunity, that is going to use the B and T cells receptors, obviously, for specific organism, like encapsulated, and they can recognize everything. The response for innate, non-specific recognition, you can have a response within minutes, within hours, depending on the infection. And remember that in innate, you don't have memorization. Memorization are mostly for adaptive. So for adaptive, is going to be more specific how it's going to answer, and this is what is going to take days to years to have a response of it. And these are exposure, exposure, exposure. Example allergies. You might not have allergy the first time that you have penicillin, but you might have it after 3 years down the road. So you have memorization happening with it. Keep that in mind. Those are multiple questions. So this is almost the same thing that I showed you earlier. This is from the first aid, just to see the. There's one thing in here that so the pumps is going to be the same thing. Is the toll-like receptor. that I should add on that table, but it's the same thing. The pattern recognition receptor to recognize pathogen-associated molecular pattern, which is the pumps. The secreted proteins we talked about earlier, C-reactive protein is one of them. Defensin, as the adaptive would be immunoglobulin. So innate and adaptive as interaction, you're going to have three big interaction here as cooperation between them. It's opsonization, complement activation, and cytokine secretion. Opsonization, we know about now, that is about coating, is about attraction, and you're going to coat with antibodies and to become activated. Once the antibodies start to be activated, you're going to have two aspects. You're going to have the activation of the cytotoxicity cells, and you're going to have the antibody-dependent cellular phagocytosis. So because of opsonization, you can allow the destruction of the foreign body and the phagocytosis of that foreign bodies. Complement activation, that is about, remember, the main thing is going to be the C3 convertase, that you're going to have two pathways. We're going to talk about the complement because those are big questions as well. So you're going to have the classical pathway versus the antibody C1 pathway. Cytokine secretion, and those are for the T cells helper, so CD4, that will lead to an additional innate cellular response to an aggression. But like I said earlier, you need to know your different linea and what would give you what. We did that in hematology, so review it multiple times because that will tell you just about myeloid versus non-lymphoid type of cells. The immune cells, I'm not going to go over them. We did go over them multiple times, so review them and know them very well, how they look like and what they do. So I'm going to skip this, up to you to review it. The lymphocyte development structure as well. This is about the VDG recombination, which we did go over. This one I'm going to go a little bit over it. Remember that you have multiple features for lymphocytes, and that is the location, the recombination, the selection, proliferation, and how they're going to act. So location, remember the lymphocyte, the B would be, once again, bone marrow, the T would be thymus. The VDG recombination is going to rearrange all the genetic material. This is how they're going to adapt and memorize. So this is why you're going to have new B cells that are going to be unique and specific, as well as new T cells receptors that are going to be new and very specific. Positive selection order, you need to T cells need to be actional and functional to allow the destruction. Proliferation, they need to multiply and they need to be numerous when the infection comes, and then you need to control them, otherwise a big problem is going to be. And this is why you need to have negative selection to remove all the cells that target self antigens, otherwise you're going to have autoimmune disease. And this is why, actually, once again, you don't have autoimmune disease going on. So what does it mean? V, it means variable. G, it means joining. D means diversity. And remember, these allow the change in the genetic material within the lymphocyte to adapt to specific situations. And those are going to be completely random, depending on what you're going to have. This is why you can call them recombination, VDG recombinations. So what is going to be changing here? And this, know it for your tests. Many questions about it. The random nucleotide addition to hypervariable region. And that is representing the protein T, big T, DT. You're going to have the different chains of the receptor, and that is the heavy chain with the light chain in the B cells, And the T cells, you're going to have alpha chain and beta chain. Remember that as well. Especially the heavy chain, light chain. This is what is going to represent the different type of immunoglobulin, and that if you talk about immunoglobulin, you think about B cells. The T cell are going to have only alpha chain and beta chain, and this is because of the VDG recombination that you are allowed to have that. And then you have the hypermutation after antigen exposure, meaning that uh, this is how the antibody is going to be created, and that is only the B cells that are going to allow it, and the VDG will allow you to have this. So if you have deficiency of any of these three recombination, what happens is that the genetic is not going to be formed, and you have immunodeficiency diseases that start to apply. Cytotoxic T cells. These usually type of cell recognize the antigen on the surface of affected bodies and destroy them. And how they destroy them? Because they're going to secrete cytotoxin, and this cytotoxin usually going to allow the apoptosis to happen. The other thing that they're going to happen, especially in the bacteria and viruses, most bacteria, more than viruses, is going to be creating holes within the membrane, and that is with perforants. And once holes happen, water can start to get in and the cell blow up. B cell development, that also you need to look at it as one. The O-MALT syndrome. The O-MALT syndrome is not a high yield thing, but there was one question, very rare question about them, which is it's an autoimmune recessive that is combined immunodeficiency associated. So you have hypermorphism, missense mutation, and of the T cells and B cells. So you're going to have a lot of type of combination activation genes that is going to lead you to many issues. And this is part of Dijon syndrome as well, and Charge syndrome at the same time, in this type of disease. Um, so that is a disease of the pro B cells. Okay, so once again, it's not super high yield at all, but just in case. So here's giving you the different stage of B cell development and what can happen to those cells. We went over them last time, so I suggest you to go over them as well. But just remember anything the B cells and T cells, think about the recombination. VDG, heavy chain only is going to be an issue with the pro cells. So T cell precursor, you're going to have in the timer CD8, CD4, and these are positive selection. And then you have separation between CD4, CD8. CD8 will be cytotoxic, CD4 become helper, and the helper usually are going to stimulate different type of white cells. So what is important about this one is all what will stimulate those cells. So the helper T cell is going to be the Th1 cells, T cells, that you're going to use until interferon gamma, interleukin 12, and for the Th2, going to be used interleukin 2 and 4, the Th17, TGF beta, interleukin 6, and the TREG will be the TGF beta. These are questions for your test, immunological question for your test. So know them. This allow the stimulation and migration. I think there's a table that I put later on. So here, obviously, earlier we saw the B cells. Here's the T cells from the precursor, double negative, double positive. And the double positive, this is the arrangement of the alpha. Remember, you have alpha chain and beta chain. And the double positive would be the rearrangement of the alpha T cells chain. And these what are going to express the CD4 and CD8. It's a positive, since positive selection. So this will give you the two classes, class 1 and class 2, which represents CD4, CD8, and T cell receptor. So I remember one thing, and this is why I put it in bold. This is a big question. The MSC2 bind to the CD4 cells. The MSC1 bind to CD8 cells. Know this, dream with it, do everything with it. It should be a reflex when you see it. The precursor, since that is mostly within the thymus, you're going to have DiGeorge syndrome issue if you don't have the thymus, but there's no surface protein. The negative one is arrangement of the beta cell, beta T cells receptors chain. So positive is alpha, negative is beta, and these are pre-T cells. Single positive, that is about migration to the medulla when they mature. And so you're going to have already in here the CD4, CD8. And the transcription for it is going to, for the this migration is going to be through the air, the factor air that are allow these to express the protein when they grow. The mature T cells, once again, you know by now, they are either CD4, CD8, and they circulate with their antigens. Okay, so these are receptors, surface receptors that you must know. Why you must know this is mostly for the leukemias, and sometimes they are asked in the question. We did see many questions in the past with all this CD, surface protein. And once again, lymphomas are going to be very handy for you to know. So the natural killer cells. So natural killer cells are innate cells that kill anything that do not have any MHC. Keep that in mind. And their surface receptor would be the MHC receptor and CD56. What they're going to produce, once again, we saw that earlier, perforin and some other enzymes. B cells, antibodies, CD19, 20, 21, CD40. Remember lymphomas. And obviously antibodies. The killer are going to be killer cells, T cells, usually kill any infected cells. They have CD2, CD3, CD8, and are pretty much toxic. Helper, that's CD8, CD3, CD4. So similar to the killer almost, the side of the CD4. So CD8 cytotoxic. And regulatory T cells, which are suppressing the immunity. And here you're going to have all the CD3, CD4. What you notice is CD3, CD4 come commonly to helper and killer T cells. And the deficiency of the regulatory T cells are going to lead you to obviously immunodeficiency, uh, which we call the IPEX, which is immune dysregulation, polyendocrineopathy, enteropathy, and X-linked syndrome. These are going to be the association they're going to have them. And you're going to notice that most of them, the mother is going to be the one that give the disease. You're going to have a lot of issue with the GI, the heart, and endocrine regulation, and they are immunodeficient. And for these, DRG10, TGB, they're not much asked. But beside this, this is what you need to remember, all the Fox PTX, P3. But those killer cells, you need to know them. Okay, guys, I think we're going to stop here today. Tomorrow we keep going with the helper T cells and what they're producing as various, all the variation. So tomorrow we're going to try to do question for 1 hour, and tomorrow it's going to be at 6:30, at 6. Yeah, why? No, because tomorrow I start classes, and starting from following week, then is going to be the full thing, and after the 28th, I think we're going to do everything at 6 o'clock. Yeah, because I forget about tomorrow 6. So yeah, we're going to